Hello everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Big Ideas by XKDR Forum. Today we have with us Anjali Sharma, who has considerable industry experience of working in the corporate sector of over a decade, as well as in the policy and think tank space. Thanks for doing this, Anjali. Welcome to the Big Ideas episode.
Thanks, Pavithra.
So, Anjali, what is the idea that you would like to discuss today?
So, Pavithra, I'll discuss an idea today which is a pet peeve that many of us have. All of us have faced the experience of handling reams of paper whenever we have to undertake any significant transaction in our life. So, for instance, most of us would have multiple photocopies of our KYC documents. Most of us would hold physical documents of our investments. Many of us will hold, original insurance documents. If you undertake high value transactions like buying a property or a car, you will hold many, many physical documents certifying many parts of that purchase transaction. And so today's idea that I want to discuss with you is there a possibility of a dream of a paperless world, and what will it take to get there?
So, when you think about moving to a paperless work, currently it's advocated in almost all sectors. In your opinion, is this a desirable world, and why do you think so?
So, personally, I am a votary of moving to a paperless world, and the reason I will articulate for it is that the the set of processes that lead to the creation of paper and its use in any transaction effectively also create extensive discretion and an extensive requirement for presence in the processes, right? So, for instance, when you have to sign a paper, you have to be present. There'll be somebody in front of whom you have to be present, who will then witness your signature, or you have to go physically somewhere and stand in a queue. So, this entire process by which we arrive at a paper document essentially has a lot of presence and discretion related friction that exists. In the world where you move to a paperless form, some of these frictions will go away. So the requirement of presence will completely go away, which means that it will become a more rule-based system where if you meet the requirements to generate that document digitally, you will be able to generate it digitally. Then the discretion of the person sitting behind a counter or sitting at the desk somewhere who is enabling this will go away entirely. So I think that's one reason why we should be more aligned to the idea of moving to a paperless world. The second bit which actually sort of comes to my mind is, and this is a slightly mixed argument, is some people may say that not everyone will have access to digital tools to generate a digitized document, whereas a paper is a more accessible format. Many more people will be able to do it. And I agree with that. So essentially, I think that it will require us to set up an incentive-based system where people switch because it is so easy to do a digital document, generate a digital document using a set of processes that are digital. And we should rely on the power of the private market to solve the accessibility issue. So today we have many intermediaries that allow the generation of a paper document or an instrument. Similarly, I have full faith that there will be many intermediaries who will come up and who will allow the generation of a digital document for those who don't otherwise have access to digital tools, right? So that market will emerge. It's a new market. And hence the exclusion argument will gently and slowly resolve itself. Okay.
And what do you think are the steps for this transformation to a digital world, especially as you mentioned the low penetration of digitization and technology in the country? How do you think about solving that?
So I will take a step back from thinking simply about tech tools around generating a paperless world, and I'll go to, for example, the multiple elements in the recipe to generating a paperless world. So the first step in my mind is the instrument itself. So today, for instance, if you and I want to enter into a contract with each other, or I want to declare something and give it to you, then you and I have to agree on the contents of that document, right? So how do we create a world in which a document can be agreed by two people and cannot be changed later, right?
Right.
So we need to get into that world where a final agreed upon set of terms and conditions is put down on paper and becomes immutable. Okay, so that's step one to it. The second in my mind is sort of the interface with the state. So today, what we have done is we have created this world, governments have created this world where they treat a document associated with a transaction as the point of taxability. Right, so we have this world of stamp duty payment that has to be done, where government wants to use the instrument slash document to collect some cess or some tax from citizen, right? The second, for example, is in the case where property rights are being changed through a contract or a document, there is the requirement to register that property right? And we have this whole world of registration, registrable versus non-registrable documents. So the first step is to create an immutable, agreed upon set of terms kind of a document. The second is to figure out how the interface of this document with the state agencies will take place. So how will it get stamped? How will it get registered? And here in India, we have this unique problem of having a federal structure problem, that each state has its own stamp law. If they have a common law, then they will have differential rates of chargeability of duty. You have the requirement of registrars. Some registrars may have the infrastructure for digitization, some might not. And so we have variability in the infrastructure for digitization at the points of contact in the state, right? So that's the second leg. The third leg in my mind is the validation of the document, which essentially is the signature. Right? So today we have a world where you have a wet signature process and you have the notarization or the witnessing process that takes place, where you sign in front of somebody to prove that it is you who signed. And here the world has moved really fast. We now have a very robust system of e-sign which is available. There is this whole Aadhaar-based e-sign infrastructure which is available. I think most of us have had the experience of using Aadhaar-based e-sign on signing our IT returns, for example, and there is a degree of familiarity around that. So there is this requirement for validating the document, and this validation is at 2 points. The first is at the point where the first signature is being done. And the second is, every time that document is accessed by somebody, there has to be a validation that this signature is correct, right? So 2 steps in the validation infrastructure need to be present. The third bit of it is to creating acceptance for these documents, right? And this is where the entire legal framework machinery needs to come into play, where the legal framework first needs to work to create acceptance for a paperless document. So for instance, if I wish to submit a paperless document to a court today, do I have the ability to do so? Or is there some court rule which essentially says, no, you have to submit in triplicate, or you have to do this, you have to take a printout, submit it to the court registry. So we need to create a world where we remove this friction of submitting physical documents out when we are creating a world of digitization. The second is, there's a legal framework for acceptance. So IT Act today says that some types of documents, there is a presumption of validity for e-sign, there is a presumption for a digital document. That needs to become more ubiquitous and people need to know more about it, right?
Right.
The second part of it is that most of the time, why are we generating these transaction documents, right? So we are undertaking transactions as private parties, but there is a likelihood of a dispute or a failure in the transaction, at which point these documents need to go as and become part of the enforcement system. So there is a court that needs to accept them and to recognize them. And so things like the Evidence Act, whether the Evidence Act will accept a digital document, what type of document, what kind of evidence it will be treated as. And so there is a whole range of work to be done on creating the legal infrastructure that enables a digital document to be validly created, accepted, and widely used. I think that is a big task. Many bits of it have been done. So, for example, the IT Act exists, it has been amended. There's some proposed change to the Stamp Act that is in place. Many courts have actually done things to allow such digitization to take place. There is Evidence Act, which has been as a so Section 65 of Evidence Act actually allows for digital documents to be some. But all of this needs to be thought of more cohesively. Okay?
Right.
There is still a significant amount of friction that needs to be thought of. Then we need to create the technological infrastructure for initial and subsequent verification. And in my mind, there are 3 parts of that infrastructure. The first is the e-sign verification. So every time I should I open the document, there's some centralized e-sign tech-based verification that should tell me that this is a original document with the original e-sign, right? And any tampering should be visible. So anyone who opens it should be able to tell that it is been tampered with. The second is the stamping verification, right? So I should be able to take that unique stamp number, go and check. There should be some API kind of a check where I can actually verify that this is a valid stamp, it was paid, generate some information about it, get some validation created, so that again you have solved the problem of stamping. And the third bit is the property right registration. Can I have a registrar whose records can be checked to see whether this registry? So how do we get over the hurdle of creating an immutable document through a technological solution? I think that needs to be solved in some way. Is some of this already taking place? And the answer is yes. Many private firms are doing many legs of this. There are firms that provide e-sign services. There are firms that provide e-stamping services. It is ubiquitous in industries which are large users of contracts. Often these entities are operating on the edge of the law. And the reason for this is that the law is a law written for paper-based transactions. So most laws will say on paper, stamped on paper, impressed stamp, things like that. And hence they don't actually give recognition to a completely digital process. But for the sake of acceptance and ease, people have moved on, and no one has challenged it in court substantively because it generally benefits the system, right? The third part of it is to essentially figure out who are the existing vested interests in this paper-based ecosystem, and can they be gently and slowly displaced through business models into becoming intermediaries in a digital ecosystem. Otherwise, the biggest resistance to this will come from people who are flourishing in the paper-based system, right? And I think that needs to be thought through into how this kind of transition takes place.
So when we are thinking about this change towards a digital world, what do you think is the unit of this change, right? I think inter say private parties, there is still a lot of discretion involved, and they would be able to, I think there are blockchain technologies right now where these transactions are validated. But I think the primary problem arises when there's an interface with the state. And in that case, do you think there should be a sector-centric approach to this? How should the state and the private firms, when they're interacting with the state, should be thinking about this?
So I think there are no easy answers to this question. I mean, the challenge here is to say that we need to, do we take a all or nothing approach to this, right? And I think that's where the answers will emerge. So suppose we say that inter se private party contracts are really what we are after. And all we need to do is to solve the infrastructure problem for them. So let me start by saying that if we say that we will solve this problem one block at a time, can we just e-sign? Okay. Can we e-sign and e-stamp?
Pick the lowest hand.
Can we e-sign, e-stamp, e-register? Can we e-sign, e-stamp, e-register and present in court? Okay. We need to think of this as blocks and not say that there is an entire grand solution that needs to be presented. Of course, the grand solution works when acceptance is if the court changes its behavior and says, I will only accept digital, everybody, the entire ecosystem will evolve. And that's a really nice way of going about it. But the challenge is for the courts to say, I will accept, they have to have the confidence that the entire ecosystem is functioning. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg. And I do think that here is where there is a significant role of the state to evangelize and enable. Okay, not necessarily to mandate and not necessarily to say to a party or another that you must use digital documents or you must use this technology versus that. I think what they need to do is to fix the legal framework. They need to create, at least for a while, parallel points of acceptance. So wherever there is paper-based acceptance, can a parallel system of digital acceptance be created? And let citizens gently switch between the two, right? I think the paper infrastructure already exists. It's a question of how you can gently dismantle it over a period of time as its use goes down. Right? And I think some structured thinking needs to go on how the state can evangelize and enable this. It's an important step, but in my view, the role of the state is as an enabler and a legal framework creator. You have to let the private parties come with the solution of how the tech and the processes will be changed. The third bit in this is that state needs to amend this whole host of laws which actually require repeated paper-based transactions. So, for example, KYC is a very good example. For the longest time, most of us would have to go to a branch, present a KYC document, sign it in physical, and then the branch would accept that as a KYC. Today, you have this entire movement of tokenization. So, if you have submitted a set of KYC documents, it goes to a KYC registry. You get a number, unique number, and ideally, at any point a KYC asks, you should be able to present that number and get away with not having to produce the paper again. So, to some extent, some thought on tokenization that will lead to the sort of the demand for paper, right? The instances of transactions that require paper, we need to think more carefully. And often state is the party that perpetuates this requirement, right? Most of us have documents because we have to give them to the state. Some education certificate has to be, some driver's license. Today, I don't carry my driver's license with me ever. It's always on my that Parivahan app or whatever it is. And there are such solutions that can be thought of. But the danger here is for the state to take an overbearing role in this transaction and essentially say that I will run the Parivahan app, I will run the sort of the DigiLocker, anything that goes here is valid and nothing else is valid. Therein lies the problem. I think we have to create the infrastructure of validation in a manner that anyone should be able to step into this game and essentially run a viable business model. And I have no doubt there'll be multitudes of tech companies who will do that as long as there is a scalable business model. And given the size of the Indian market in terms of transaction intensity, there might just be a good business model here.
I just wanted to ask on the people aspect of these things, both whether it's in the state or even the citizens, right? The resistance of a change, especially something that they're traditionally used to. What are your views on that?
So there will clearly be a transition period. And in that transition, I mean, the idea is not to make a shock and awe switch, right? You can't say that, from tomorrow I'll stop accepting physical documents and only digitization will work. There has to be a transition period where both these systems work. There will be a certain cost to that transition period where you will create dual infrastructure. Right. But in the long run, because it leads to reduction in frictions, both discretionary frictions as well as presence-related frictions, I think it might just be a more optimal solution that emerges. But for a while, there is no getting away from the fact that you will have to run parallel systems. The good thing is that we know today that setting and up and running of tech systems is not a very expensive thing. Right? So the physical infrastructure already exists. It's functioning poorly in many cases. We know its pitfalls, right? Every time I go to a SRO or where I'm standing in a long queue and thousands of documents are being signed by me, I know what the problems in that system are. And so if I'm given a digital alternative, I might switch, some intermediary might help me to do it. So this whole income tax return filing journey or the passport seva journey, much of this tells us that successful digitization is possible if we can offer a nice incentive-based system to citizens to adopt it, right? But you're right, it cannot be a shock and awe switch, right? We have to have a transition period.
And you mentioned that some of these switches and changes are already happening. What is the extent, in what sectors are this happening, and what more should we do to make it bigger?
So often, private businesses will emerge where transaction aggregation takes place, right? So the banking sector has always been a sort of a point at which all of these innovations take place and all of these things get adopted first, for the simple reason that that's the place where you get 13 crore transactions taking place every year, right? And that's sort of what attracts private players instead of going and finding a firm where all of 500 transactions may take place in a full year, right? So banking sector is one which uses e-sign quite extensively. E-stamping is used quite extensively again in the banking sector, though again, as I said, it is not fully understood what the legal risks of that are. There are some questionable practices going on there. And the challenge is that the drop-off in the digital journey. So if I said that I want to create a completely presence-less digital system where you and I don't need to meet each other, it's on an app, We generate a document, we pick a template, for example, that exists, we make a modification, it becomes we e-sign it, we e-stamp it. If it's a non-registrable document, it just gets, there's some entity that stores this for us. We give our consent for data sharing as required. And this entire infrastructure functions seamlessly. Today, there are a lot of drop-offs, right? And many of the drop-offs are because of law. So you have to maintain a physical copy. At some point, you have to take a print and keep it. There are these kind of laws which says that if you have paid stamp duty in one state and you take the instrument, now what does take the instrument to another state mean in the world of digitization, right? So these kind of questions come from the law, and some of them will clarify it if the law becomes clear. So many of these are not technological hurdles or process hurdles of the private parties who are keen to adopt. Many of these are hurdles which exist because of the legal framework and are eminently fixable, because these are low hanging fruit even in the legal framework design, right? So if we go by the general theory that if you make a transaction more efficient, many more of that type of transactions will take place. Effectively, it is in the interest of the state to modify and modernize these transactions, because today, for example, if so many people are getting instruments stamped or are paying a certain amount of stamp duty, the effectiveness of the stamp duty transaction itself will go up, right? And evasion will become harder. And every time you go, so one hopes that there is a medium term game for the state in this also, in becoming more effective. But we have to see whether people are recognizing this as much as we hope they will do. There's also this final element of citizen service delivery, right? And the interface on citizen service delivery just becomes far more efficient when so many people don't need to show up to a location, right? So we have so many government schemes. Let's say the entire registration process for that scheme can be completely digitized, not where, there's a digital website where you have to enter everything, but after that, 50 other physical processes. So I think that citizen facing services might become far better if we are able to crack this puzzle. And not all of them require the enforcement leg, right? There are certain type of documents that require enforcement, certain will not. And so we need to be able to create these systems for the lower hanging fruit far ahead of time, and maybe come to the more complex registration. Property right creation might be the last leg in this, because there may be other angles to explore.
Okay. Final question to you is that what are the risks involved if there are decision makers in firms and government? What should they be thinking about, especially when it's digital? Then the main question of privacy starts coming in. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, we have to view the pros and cons of any new system vis-a-vis the pros and cons of the existing system, right? So, of itself, digitization has a standard set of risks that it comes with. And you have mentioned some of them. Trust is a big risk. Data security is a big risk. Privacy is a big risk. And there are solutions that exist for these risks in many other contexts. So, it's not like there is a specific unique solution that is required for this instance. There are solutions that exist. And again, the role of the state here can be as an enabler and an evangelist, essentially, that comes out with these guidelines and good practices and encourages certifications for entities who become aggregators, so that trust is built into the system, right? So that's one. The second bit of it is that state itself is a big creator, user, and acceptor of documents. And state needs to think more carefully about its capacity in respect of these things, right? So I actually won't worry as much about a private entity, like for instance, when I give my documents to a bank. I have some privacy related worries, but I may not have as many security and trust related worries, right? Whereas when I give a document to government, I have a trust related worry, I have a security related worry, I have a privacy related worry. So I think we need to think of first principle ways of mitigating some of these worries. But this is a journey, right? So it's not that, like I said, there are no shock and awe solutions, but they are eminently doable. The same thing that works for a private sector entity should ideally work for government. On these issues, there is no grand variation in, for example, consent-based access to instruments, etc. Ultimately, they are technological solutions. The second is, what is the risk vis-a-vis a private process, a paper-based process, right? So, for example, paper-based processes are full of frictions and risks. Paper can be destroyed. There is a storage cost to it. There is the human cost to it. Like I said, you have to queue up, you have to be present, somebody will exercise their discretion. When you compare some of the risks that the digital system poses, we have to view them as doing two things. One is to overcome the risks that the physical process was posing. So that's the net benefit out of it. And to say that the new risks that are being posed by this are manageable risks, and so they can be mitigated. So no sort of unmanageable risk is being created out of this. And if we have the right mix of role of state and many private parties, there's also a market-based mechanism where some fly-by-the-night guys will not be trusted, they'll be used, something will fail, and people will then aggregate to a more safe entity that provides the same service, right? So there is also a market-based correction mechanism on these things.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anjali. This was great.
Thank you, Pavitra.
Okay.